Welcome to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams. Shifting foreign aid from taxpayers to tithepayers, Senator Curtis suggests the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and other groups can help fill the void. Utah lawmakers' own study found gender-affirming care benefits trans youth. Will they lift the treatment ban? And how scientists manage the Great Salt Lake's wetlands, one of the most prolific mosquito habitats in the West. Later in the program, we'll be talking with Salt Lake Tribune State Watch reporter Emily Anderson-Stern. Right now, we bring in Tribune West Side Communities reporter Jose Davila IV. Jose, thanks for joining us.
No problem. Thanks for having me, Tom.
I want to talk with you about several stories. We'll start with the mosquitoes. And we're all very grateful for the mosquito abatement folks. You went and talked to Salt Lake City's mosquito abatement district folks. Where do they worry about? I guess mosquitoes, it's standing water, right? It's fields. Well, I guess it could be, as you point out in your story, hollows in trees and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they have a really kind of dual program. There's a whole team dedicated to rural areas. And in the Salt Lake City Mosquito Abatement District, those are the wetlands of the Great Salt Lake. Now, they may be farms, they may be hunting clubs or duck clubs, or they just might be, protected wetlands. But then they also have an urban program. And that urban program is responsible for catch basins in the city, ornamental ponds, tree holes. So really, they are looking for mosquitoes in anywhere that kind of could collect water. And obviously, those are different habitats with different treatments depending on where they are.
So they have some permanent employees and then seasonal. How many of each?
Joe, the permanent staff, if I'm not mistaken, is only about 13 people. Those are, the executive director, scientists that are directing their labs, as well as supervising those kind of teams of seasonal employees that you're more likely to see out in the community. And then the seasonal employees, it's a real mixed bag. Some folks have been, coming back and working seasonally at the Mosquito Abatement District for a long time. But many are college students, including some Utah State students who come down during the summer and, maybe pursuing technical or science or engineering degrees. The Mosquito Abatement District is a great place to kind of get some real hands-on research and learn about, doing science kind of actively in a day-to-day job.
So I guess in any given area, especially in a wetland kind of an area, Salt Lake's situated next to a wetland, we're talking about, I don't know, millions and millions and millions of mosquitoes, right?
Oh, yes. Like they showed us when we went, staff showed us a cooler, like a full, double Coleman cooler, just filled with mosquitoes. And it was 1.8 million mosquitoes.
Wow.
And those are the mosquitoes they capture just for surveillance purposes. They're not even trying to take mosquitoes out of the environment with that in that particular program. They're just trying to track what types of mosquitoes are out there, where exactly they're at, where they're gathering, how they're moving across the wetlands, possibly towards the city. But yes, 1.8 million mosquitoes just last year. And then there was a couple more. There's another like 300,000 or so that were somewhere else. So they think they captured 2.1 million mosquitoes last year. And that's just for surveillance purposes.
Now, of course, mosquitoes are really annoying, but also there's diseases, right? West Nile virus. Tell me about some of the diseases we worry about.
Yeah, so I believe the district tracks three major diseases. West Nile being kind of the most well-known and perhaps the most dangerous, St. Louis encephalitis, as well as Western equine. And they are trying to, figure out which mosquitoes are carrying which diseases. They're constantly running basically like if you remember PCR tests from the COVID pandemic, they're running PCR tests on these mosquitoes to figure out what kind of viruses they're carrying. It's the same scientific process basically. And yeah, they're trying to protect public health. They're also trying to prevent, nuisance biting, right? The mosquito abatement district was formed. It was only the third district in the nation, the Salt Lake City Mosquito Abatement District, at a time in the early 1900s when we still didn't know that mosquitoes could carry disease. So it was actually formed because, the Salt Lake City residents of the time were just wanted to go outside in the summer without having to swat mosquitoes.
So I think most people are familiar with spraying, right? Here in the Logan area, I'm used to in the summertime, trucks or something will come down the road just spraying, pesticide. But I learned from your story there's a lot more that they try to get at these mosquitoes a lot earlier than the spraying. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so it's a real practice of the mosquito abatement district to try and kill off mosquitoes when they are larvae. So when they're babies, right? Or juveniles, I suppose, they are confined to the water, right? Because they grow up in the water. That's why dumping out, your standing water at your house is so important. And the reason to focus on larvae is that you can apply pesticides, and specifically non-chemical pesticides, much easier and much more effectively when these mosquitoes are confined to little patches of water versus when they're flying in the air. When you're flying in the air, you have to spray more indiscriminately and you have to use harsher pesticides. So one example, we went out with the rural team in mid-April, and they were using to kind of cover this field that was pockmarked with little puddles out in the wetlands. They were using once they found a larva, they were using these little corn cob granules that were kind of coated with this naturally occurring organism that basically prevents the mosquitoes from growing up. And basically, they took an ATV out and were with a hopper off the back of the ATV, like a hopper you might see on a farm. They were distributing those granules into these little pools. And that's a way to kind of stop those larvae from, becoming adult mosquitoes and menacing the population.
It's quite ingenious. I'm looking at a photograph here of a carbon dioxide trap. It's kind of looks like an IV from a distance. So carbon dioxide is what attracts mosquitoes.
Yeah, so mosquitoes are attracted to the breath of mammals. The breath. Yeah, the breath of mammals. Some other organisms too. They'll bite birds. Some species, but we produce carbon dioxide, and so what the mosquito abatement district has created is a trap that attracts mosquitoes by feeding carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, into the air, and then the mosquitoes are attracted to it, and then they basically go into this netting and then at the top of the netting there's a computer fan, actually a repurposed computer fan that keeps the mosquitoes in the trap without killing them. There's just the pressure from the fan. And yeah, that's how they collect the mosquitoes. They 3D print their own traps. They found that after doing a lot of research that they could do it for cheaper, and they published a paper on how to create those traps that it seems like some other mosquito abatement teams use throughout the country. And yeah, they're pretty simple. They're just a canister of CO2, a computer fan, and some netting, and that's how they trap 2 million mosquitoes a year.
2 million mosquitoes a year trapped. Yeah. By the way, is there? It seems like you're just kind of you use the word Sisyphean, I think, in the story. There's always going to be millions and millions of mosquitoes. You're just trying to tamp down the number. Do they have measures for success at the abatement district?
Well, I think a lot of the measure for success is, how much are they limiting virus cases? My understanding was last year there was not a single West Nile virus case in Salt Lake City. There were a few, I believe, in St. George. I could be wrong about that, but right, they're trying to limit disease. They're trying to limit disease vectors. I'm sure also they're keeping track of how many complaints they're getting and where they're getting those complaints, right? So one thing that they're really trying to do is to keep mosquitoes west of 215. So keep them west of the airport. Well, in some cases west of the airport, but certainly west of 215, because to the east of 215, that's where the west side is. That's where people live, and then of course, then you get further into the east side of the city. And so, if they can limit, biting to people who are hunting at the duck clubs, or enjoying scenic vistas along the lake, I think they consider that a win. When they're seeing more biting happening, in the city, folks are calling in saying, "I've got a mosquito problem at my house. I can't enjoy my backyard." Right? That's when I think that's when they get a little concerned.
Now, I mentioned spraying. They try to get it at the larval stage, right, and earlier, but there is spraying that happens. Some criticize that as I guess Utah Physicians for Healthy Environment. The story says that those sprays could be dangerous for humans.
Yes. This is something that Utah Physicians for Healthy Environment have kind of long criticized the mosquito abatement district for. And basically, especially these more chemical pesticides that are basically created in a lab. They're worried that those sprays, one, aren't so targeted and limited to the mosquitoes. Like, it's very possible that humans and other animals could be affected by these pesticides. Specifically, I believe Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment is worried about our endocrine system, and that's a real concern when it comes to these pesticides. Could affect the kind of regulation of our bodies. And so they have a whole campaign to get people to basically say no to having chemical pesticides spraying at their homes. And there are other programs that the Mosquito Abatement District uses, even in urban context. So, for example, for those ornamental ponds I mentioned earlier, the Mosquito Abatement District actually breeds western mosquito fish that eat mosquito larvae in ornamental ponds. And so, those fish, they're non-native. So this application is limited just to, ornamental ponds, retention basins, places where the fish are not going to, go out into the natural environment. But that's a one way that, if you do have an ornamental pond and you're worried about chemical pesticides, there's still a way that you can reduce your mosquitoes.
Well, you can check out Jose's story at sltrib.com. There's some other factors we didn't cover here, but I wanted to get on to another story here as well. This is a recent story of Jose's developer that demolished Utah Pickle Company building in Granite District says the rebuild will include some original bricks. This gets into, I guess, preservation, and then some buildings you just can't preserve. Tell me just briefly your 1-minute version of this story.
Yeah, there was on Wednesday morning, folks got pretty alarmed when some construction crews started tearing down the Utah Pickle Company building in the granary. That building, people were specifically alarmed because under an agreement with the city, that building was supposed to be preserved. Seems like things have changed. The developer said after more analysis, the building could not stand on its own. And there was some damage from the 2020 earthquake. And so with all of that, they have decided to tear it down and rebuild it with some of the materials. There's still some, issues with that. I think people still feel like that's not the, that's kind of a Disney World reconstruction, you might say. But it's part of this new mixed-use project. There's going to be some apartments. There's going to be some restaurant space. The developers are still preserving another historic commercial building next door as well.
This has quite the history, right? It goes back to the Grant Company, Heber G. Grant, former president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, etc. One of the people in your story just briefly said we might find with a lot of these historic buildings that the foundation just didn't was damaged too much by earthquakes.
Yeah, it is a real interesting problem, and I think Eva Lopez Chavez, who's the Salt Lake City Council member who said that, is worried that if there are more analyses of foundations and they're found to be unsafe, then more demolitions could come, and I think that is a real fear, especially in the granary, where much of the city's kind of commercial and manufacturing and industrial history is based. And some of its most, I would say, unique architecture related to those fields sits. And if those buildings go away, what's the character of Salt Lake City? What's the character of this specific neighborhood of Salt Lake City if more demolitions happen?
Well, you can check that one out at sltrib.com as well. We're going to be heading to a break here soon. I'll be talking after the break with Emily Anderson Stern. So, Jose, do you have an underplayed story of the week?
I do. I'd really recommend Jordan Miller's story from today. We did everything right. A Venezuelan family was told to leave the U.S. Their Utah neighbors wouldn't have it. It's a really interesting story. I think we've seen this slow drip of immigrant stories and ICE crackdowns since the new Trump administration took office. I think this one's another good one, and I would say it's unique because these are devout members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and that's seems like it's really helped them make connections with their neighbors, and now their neighbors are rallying around them. So it's a really interesting kind of only in Utah story.
Okay, so check that out at sltrib.com. All these stories at sltrib.com. We're going to be heading toward a break. When we come back, I'll be talking with State Watch reporter Emily Anderson Stern. Here's the headline of one of the stories anyway. Shifting foreign aid from taxpayers to tithe payers. Senator Curtis suggests the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and other groups can help fill the void. We've been talking with Westside Communities reporter Jose Davila IV. Jose, thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. And we'll have a break, and we'll have more with the Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. Stay with us. You're listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams. This part of the program, we're talking with Salt Lake Tribune State Watch reporter Emily Anderson Stern. Emily, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
Thank you. A couple stories, two or three stories we want to talk about here. Let's start with this one. Here's the headline: Shifting foreign aid from taxpayers to tithepayers. Senator Curtis suggests the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and other groups can help fill that void. So, what was the setting here when Senator Curtis made these comments?
Yeah, so the new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who used to be in the Senate, attended a hearing in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee um, this last week. And the hearing was to talk about his department's proposed budget, but he ended up being asked questions by a lot of senators, specifically Democratic senators, about cuts to foreign aid that the United States has made and the elimination of the USAID program. Uh, and so that's kind of the context of what was happening in this meeting. And, both of Utah's senators actually sit on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And so they both were there to listen and weigh in.
So, Senator Curtis is essentially saying that money that used to come from taxpayers, since USAID and other programs have been dismantled, could now come from churches?
Yeah, as Democratic lawmakers were bringing up some of the cuts that have been made and their perspectives on those, the impacts that they say they're seeing, um, Senator Curtis, when he had his turn to speak, chimed in and said, uh, you know, he pointed out that there are philanthropic entities that can step in and fill the void. And he specifically said, in Utah, we have the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And he said, quote, that they are really ready to stand up and go to work.
What did Secretary Rubio say?
Uh, he responded, you know, he said absolutely. And then he went on and explained how he sees future foreign aid working where decisions are driven by embassies and regional bureaus rather than the State Department's offices in Washington. But it is interesting to note that Senator or Secretary Rubio now is a former Latter-day Saint himself.
Yeah. Uh, what did Democrats on the panel have to say? Where were they focusing?
Um, a lot of it was just that, for the past several decades, the United States has used foreign aid as a to basically practice its foreign policies, to extend diplomacy, and I think, has been used in a way to try to encourage developing countries, particularly to implement political systems that are uh, democratic in some way. And they, were saying that this basically tears down all of the work that's been done over the last 60, 70 years.
What did Senator Lee say?
So his line of questioning was a bit different from Senator Curtis's or um, some of the Democrats on the committee. And he was focused on the future of the United States giving funding to international organizations, which has been a part of, and whether the United States should continue to contribute financially to those organizations.
Let's talk about specifically Senator Curtis's church, church based here in Utah, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. There's been a lot of reporting in the past year or two about the church's investment portfolio, the church's wealth. There have been calls by some church members and others for the church to increase their humanitarian aid, right?
Right. And I will say, this is the part in the story. I worked on this story with my colleague, faith reporter Tamara Kemsley, and this is the part where she kicked in. And we worked together where brought a lot of the faith information and I brought the politics information. And yeah, she discussed, how much money the LDS Church has and how much it has previously given toward charitable causes, especially with global initiatives. And she talked to some members, or at least one Latter-day Saint who's involved in administering aid abroad about um, the current state of foreign aid and where the church fits in and where he believes the church should fit in.
So Brad Walker's a physician. I guess he runs or is head of Bountiful Children's Foundation. Um, he was saying that he's skeptical that the church could build out infrastructure. It makes more sense if the church is giving money to other build up organizations.
Right. And that is true. Governments have better access to certain supply chains, to, different shipping lanes than, say, a private religious organization does. And so he said that if the United States were to move in a direction where it relied almost entirely on private faith-based organizations, he is not sure that they would have the capability of doing what a government can, especially, the United States, which has historically been the richest government in the world and considered the most powerful.
I'll just quote here, read a line from yours in tomorrow's story here. This concept of shifting the financial burden of welfare from taxpayer to tithepayer has a precedent right here in the Beehive State. And then you cite a ProPublica investigation found that the state apparently just kind of bakes in a percentage that would come from the church for poor people.
Right. It's similar where that's ProPublica found essentially that the state had not created as much of a safety net for its poorest residents as in other states, and instead kind of relied on the LDS Church to fill that gap. And something that's been raised that was raised around that was where when governments rely on faith-based organizations to fill those gaps, then those faith-based organizations bring their principles and values to distributing aid and who can access that aid and what kind of aid they provide, right? So the ProPublica investigation found that there were instances of church leaders denying help because of someone's sexual orientation, because of whether they were members of the church or not, or members of another church, and if individuals had children out of wedlock.
You note in the story, kind of go back in a little recent history, Senator Curtis is on this committee, and when the committee was voting whether to confirm former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee as ambassador to Israel, Curtis had an exchange there, I think based on maybe some previous comments of then presidential candidate Huckabee to fellow presidential candidate Mitt Romney.
Right. So this was another hearing in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and previous Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee was being confirmed as ambassador to Israel. And, Curtis, in his remarks, talked about his time that he spent in Israel on an Israeli settlement called a kibbutz as part of a BYU, a Brigham Young University program, which is the church's private university. And he he had this opportunity to ask the nominated ambassador questions, and he's now been confirmed. He's now the ambassador to Israel. But as he had this opportunity, he said, this might be a chance for you to send a message to Utah about how you feel about our dominant faith. And then he asked if there was any sort of message that Ambassador Huckabee had for Latter-day Saint Utahns. And he also finished the remarks by inviting Ambassador Huckabee to visit BYU's Jerusalem Center.
Mm-hmm. What did the ambassador respond with?
He essentially said that he'd be happy to visit the center. He talked about his saying, he has made comments in the past that were critical of Latter-day Saints, but he did talk about his respect for the church in that particular hearing. said that he respects the church members of the church's sense of right and wrong, and that uh, he thinks that, Latter-day Saints and him as another Christian have, are drawn to an understanding of Israel for similar reasons. And I will point out, as these were the questions that Senator Curtis asked, um, Ambassador Huckabee was somewhat of a controversial nomination to fill this role. And because of remarks that he's made about Palestinians in the past.
Let's move to another story. By the way, you're listening to Behind the Headlines. We're talking with Tribune Statewide reporter Emily Anderson Stern. Here's the headline: Utah lawmakers' own study found gender-affirming care benefits trans youth. Will they lift the treatment ban? So you remind us in this story, Emily, that when the lawmakers think it's 2023, is to this ban is supposed to be a moratorium, and they commissioned a study. I think, is that correct?
Right. So back in 2023, you had this bill being debated, but there was also a second option that would have just been an outright ban without a study. The study was supposed to be something that lawmakers could look at when it was completed and reconsider whether banning this gender affirming care for transgender youth was the right direction. They could consider what policies might produce the best health outcomes for children who identify as transgender.
So who did the study?
So the Utah Department of Health and Human Services was kind of charged with overseeing, making sure this study got done. They ended up contracting with, or working with a group at the University of Utah. The name of that group is the Drug Regimen Review Center. So they looked at dozens and dozens of studies around gender affirming care for transgender people. They compiled a review of the evidence as to the impacts of treatment. It was over 1,000 pages long. And then, that study was sent to the Department of Health and Human Services here. And they had put together a team of advisors, and who was on that team was determined by what was in the law. But that team of advisors included doctors from DHHS, from the University of Utah, from Intermountain Health, from Roseman University of Health Sciences, and then other doctors from specialty physician licensing boards.
It was a more than 1,000-page report. What were their top findings?
So, it's a long report to look through it, but the findings were wrapped into a conclusion at the bottom. And the key sentence was they wrote that overall there were positive mental health and psychosocial functioning outcomes as a result of gender affirming care. And they acknowledged that there is some evidence that there could be some negative medical impacts to some forms of gender affirming care. And I will note, surgeries were not performed on gender transition. Surgeries were not performed on people under 18 before this law was passed. But this law worked to ban those. And it also worked to ban hormone treatments, which includes puberty blockers that slow down puberty for youth who identify as transgender or who are not sure about their gender identity. And they're reversible. Those hormone treatments are. But, so that a lot of this review of evidence looked at the hormone treatments. And so they found, like I said, that overall the outcomes, the mental health and psychosocial outcomes were positive. And they acknowledged a possibility of some of these treatments leading to benign brain tumors. But they also said that they found that the increase of mortality, any increase of mortality among transgender individuals who'd received or gender affirming care was due to suicide, non-natural causes, or HIV and AIDS. So causes that they know were not tied to the gender affirming care. And then they said that patients who were seen at a gender clinic for such care before the age of 18 had a much lower risk of suicide compared to those who sought that treatment as an adult.
A couple of Republicans are out with a response already, right? They're, I think, essentially rejecting the study.
Right. I, so I reached out to House leadership and Senate leadership in the legislature, and I ended up getting a statement from Representative Katie Hall, who was the House sponsor of the gender affirming care ban back in 2023. And she had a joint statement with Representative Bridger Bolender, who chairs the legislature's Health and Human Services Interim Committee, where the report was sent this week. And they said that they basically said that there's weak evidence around the impacts of around what the impacts are of gender affirming care for youth. And then they said, quote, simply put, the science isn't there, the risks are real, and the public is with us. We intend to keep the moratorium in place. So that was just, a couple days after this study was posted on the legislature's website.
What's Senate and House leadership saying, or is Governor Cox weighed in?
Senate President Stuart Adams, he, took a more measured approach and said that his senators plan to review the report, and that their priority is the well-being of Utah's children, no matter what policy direction they go.
What are? Sorry.
Yes, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, what are the Democrats saying?
Yeah, the minority leaders, they said they told me that their caucuses had not been notified that the report was posted, and that the report was available, but they urged their colleagues to slow down and read the full report and weigh what it means. And then also, as they have discussions about what to do moving forward, they would like to see the public included in those discussions.
Mm-hmm. Now, you note in your story that Mike Kennedy, who was a legislator he was the sponsor of that original bill. He's now in the U.S. House of Representatives. What is he saying?
Yeah, so I reached out to him. His office did not respond to my request for comment on the report. But, at the time, he talked a lot about how this bill, the law was not supposed to be a ban, and the purpose of it was to, from his perspective, protect kids while Utah tried to figure out the science behind gender affirming care and what the impacts of that care were. And he essentially said that he included the study so that the policy would be revisited when the review of evidence came out. And he said that he was motivated by concern for children's health. He's a physician himself, I will note. And so a lot of what he said was around the need for evidence and concern for gender affirming care's impacts to health.
Also the ACLU and National Center for Lesbian Rights had stated 2 years ago that they plan to sue. They have not yet. Did they say why?
It's something that need to get an update from them on, but the last time I touched base with them, they'd said that it's challenging they thought it would take an extended time to bring a challenge in Utah just because of the way the law was crafted. And so I will note, when the law passed, minors who had already been diagnosed with gender dysphoria, which is a mental health condition in which someone whose gender identity does not align with their sex assigned at birth experiences severe distress because of that lack of alignment. And so, for folks who had been diagnosed with gender dysphoria ahead of receiving gender affirming care, they could continue that care if it's, hormone treatments they were already prescribed when the bill passed. And because there was somewhat of a transition into enforcement of the law, lawyers thought that they in order to, have someone withstanding to challenge the law, it might take them a while to be able to do that.
University of Utah recently shut down its clinic for LGBTQ plus youth. Is that connected in any way to the legislature's ban?
Yeah, the University of Utah Health actually cited the ban as a reason for closing that clinic. They said that they'd had, since it took effect and people aged out uh, of gender affirming care, that they had not had enough patients to sustain the clinic.
Emily, you close your story with citing an article by researchers at the Trevor Project, which might indicate a link to such legislation and just having legislation such as this happens in Utah. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so, the Trevor Project, first of all, they field calls from specifically, they help LGBTQ plus youth who are in mental crises, who are considering suicide. And they collected data and they, in a report that they wrote, they said that suicide attempts have gone up in states that have passed uh, suicide attempts among transgender youth, specifically in states that have passed laws restricting transgender people's ability to live openly. And I will say that, even before these laws were passed, transgender youth indicated to state officials that they were at much higher risk of suicide. The state every 2 years conducts these student health and risk prevention surveys of some middle schoolers and high schoolers. And students who are transgender, in the last one in 2023, a quarter of students said they had attempted suicide in the previous year, and 61% said they had seriously considered it. And, if you look at the full student population that was surveyed, just 18% said they had seriously considered suicide. So you can see the numbers. Transgender youth in the state are statistically at much higher risk of suicide.
I guess the only indication we have is kind of vague is President Adams' statement as to whether the legislature is going to revisit this or not. He says we're gonna read the study and then decide, I guess.
Yeah, and I think, that could signify that the House may go one way and the Senate may go another, right? You could see um, a bill come on one side that the other side won't look at. Uh, and so we'll see what discussions happen over the next several months in the interim before the 2026 legislative session. But that will give us a bit of a better idea as to whether lawmakers will even look into this at all or revisit this policy in any way.
Let's close with your report, along with Addie Baird from the Republican State Convention. A lot of stuff happened. First, a big race for party chair. What happened there?
Right. So there were two candidates up for party chair, and the issue really that was central to the competition was the future of selecting candidates for primary elections in Utah. So currently, people can qualify one of two ways. Either they can go to the convention, and Republican delegates can vote for the candidates who will be on a primary ballot, or they can collect signatures from a certain number of people in their district or statewide if they're a statewide candidate to qualify to be on the primary ballot. Both candidates for chair do not like the current system. They would like to get rid of the signature path so that the entire power to select primary candidates lays in the hands of delegates. The main thing that separated them, though, was how they would like to approach that issue. So incumbent chair Rob Axon, he said that, he'd like to continue what he's been doing, which is lobbying the legislature to revisit the bill and get rid of signature gathering in some way, shape, or form. He's also worked with lawmakers to make changes to the signature gathering process. And, the other candidate was Phil Lyman, who ran for governor last year, which is how most people might know him. He's a former state lawmaker. And he had actually won at convention last year against Governor Spencer Cox. But then in the primary election, he lost. And he ended up suing Rob Axon, his opponent, uh, to try to force him to instead back Phil Lyman as the Republican candidate in the general election instead of Governor Spencer Cox. Under state law, that's not possible. That's not allowed. And so his case failed. But that's somewhat of the approach that Phil Lyman would have liked to have taken if he had been elected chair, was to essentially, you know, assert what he sees as the party's power in saying these are our candidates and that's how it's going to be. But the big question there is, what does that mean under where that isn't in compliance with state law? What does that do to the party? So, likely the party would have gone from what's called a qualified political party, which allows them to select candidates in convention along with the candidates who gather signatures, to a registered political party, which candidates can only qualify for the ballot by collecting signatures.
So Axon won, but it was pretty close.
Right, yeah. Rob Axon did end up coming out on top. He'd been endorsed by President Donald Trump and a number of prominent state Republican officials. And, a lot of what I was hearing ahead of the convention was people had appreciated the work that Axon did during the last election cycle in raising money for candidates. A group of Republicans went to swing states to campaign for Donald Trump. And the Utah Republican Party organized that and paid for it. And, a lot of people, in addition to people having positive relationships and opinions of Axon, some of the votes were also motivated by some concern around what might happen if Lyman had won, and what might happen to that qualified political party status, what might happen to the caucus convention system. They worried it might dissolve and that the Republican Party would be divided and fall apart.
One more thing here. This is a separate story. As we know, President Trump has been kind of teasing an idea of running for a third term, which is forbidden by the Constitution. There was apparently a resolution which would put the Utah Republican Party on record as opposing a third term run by President Trump, I guess, or any other president. What happened with that?
Yeah, so that resolution, it said it was in favor of term limits, but yeah, it specifically mentioned presidential term limits and referenced efforts by President Donald Trump, or comments by President Donald Trump, that suggest he's weighing running again in 2028. What ended up happening was, delegates have a chance to come speak at a microphone as they're debating a resolution. But the votes generally are just based on, whoever's chairing the convention. They ask for yeses and nos, and based on their sense of which one got the most, unless someone calls for division. But at that point, they would have to count with the votes. But, it just ended with the person chairing the convention, who was former Republican Party Chair Thomas Wright, saying it looks like it didn't get the votes, and that was that.
One thing that stood out to me, this is just in passing in your reporting, there's music playing in the background, right? One of the songs on the playlist was Lady Gaga's Born This Way, which seems a little, you could say, seems a little incongruous at the Republican convention.
Yeah, Born This Way, I think, is known by a lot of folks in the LGBTQ plus community as somewhat of an anthem, expressing pride about their identity. And it was a little surprising that we heard that playing at the GOP convention.
Just briefly, Governor Cox skipped the convention entirely.
Right. He did not show up. This was the second time since he was first elected governor. in 2019 that he did not show up to the convention. The last time was in 2022. He posted on X that he was attending a wedding, but I will say, there were a couple of other prominent Republicans, Representative Blake Moore and Representative Celeste Malloy, who were not able to make it. They had to stay in Washington for budget discussions. And they sent videos in with a message to delegates. And so, but Governor Cox didn't do that either. Last year, the last time he saw delegates, when he was in the middle of his reelection bid for governor, he was booed, and he's been booed at basically every convention he's shown up to since becoming governor. But a lot of delegates were pretty upset with him last year because as they were booing him, he was listing off different conservative accolades of his and saying, maybe you hate this, maybe you hate that. And then he wrapped up saying, or maybe you hate that I don't hate enough. And a lot of delegates felt that that was disrespectful toward them in their position, and they weren't too happy with those remarks. And so I imagine he likely would have been greeted with boos again if he had shown up last week.
We've been talking on Behind the Headlines with Salt Lake Tribune State Watch reporter Emily Anderson Stern. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Tom.
And you have been listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams. Hope you join me again next time.